He walked through the gates of Edwards Air Force Base, wearing a faded military jacket and a worn baseball cap, carrying a small leather briefcase that had seen better decades. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the tarmac as he approached the hangar where young pilots gathered around gleaming F-16s. "Excuse me, sir," called out Captain Derek Morrison, his voice dripping with condescension as he stepped away from his group of fellow pilots. "I think you might be lost." "The Veterans Museum tour ended an hour ago." The older man stopped, his weathered hands steady despite the laughter echoing from the group behind Morrison. He looked up with calm, steel-gray eyes that had seen more than these young men could imagine. "I'm here for the aircraft maintenance consultation," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades. Morrison's smirk widened. "Aircraft maintenance? Look, Grandpa, these aren't crop dusters. These are billion-dollar fighters that require cutting-edge expertise, not whatever this is." He gestured dismissively at the man's modest appearance. The other pilots snickered. One of them called out, "Maybe he's here to tell us stories about flying biplanes." The older man's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I understand. You'll just head on home," Morrison interrupted, his voice getting louder, attracting more attention from personnel around the hangar. "This is a serious military installation, not a retirement home." As the man turned to leave, something caught the light on his jacket collar, a small tarnished pin that none of the young pilots bothered to look at closely. What they didn't know was that tomorrow their arrogance would cost them everything they thought they knew about flying. Joesti Fakare, the man they had dismissed, walked slowly to his pickup truck, but his steps carried the measured precision of someone who had once commanded respect in places these young pilots could never imagine. His name was Colonel William Bill Harrison, though he hadn't used his rank in civilian conversation for over 2 decades. What Morrison and his crew couldn't see beneath that worn jacket was a chest that had once carried the Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 silver stars, and a Medal of Honor. Bill Harrison wasn't just any veteran. He was the founder and driving force behind the Harrison Foundation for at-risk youth aviation programs, an organization that had transformed thousands of young lives from forgotten neighborhoods across America. He had built this foundation from nothing, dedicating his heart and his expertise in aeronautical engineering to create real change where others saw only hopelessness. The foundation operated quietly from 3 small hangars in rural Texas, where Bill personally taught kids from broken homes how to rebuild engines, understand flight dynamics, and dream beyond their circumstances. Just last month, a young woman named Sofia Ramirez, whose father had abandoned the family when she was 8, graduated from his program and earned a full scholarship to the Air Force Academy. Bill had spent his own savings to buy her first flight suit, but tonight, as he drove home to his modest ranch house, Bill felt something he hadn't experienced in years: doubt. Martha, his wife of 47 years, was waiting on the porch as always. She'd been a Navy nurse during Vietnam, and she could read the weight in his shoulders from 50 yards away. "Rough day at the base?" she asked, not needing to hear the details to understand. Bill sat beside her, removing his cap to run fingers through gray hair that had once been regulation cut black. "Maybe they're right, Martha. Maybe I'm just some old relic trying to stay relevant in a world that's moved past me." Martha's hand found his, her touch still steady despite decades of caring for wounded soldiers. "Bill Harrison, you've been doubting yourself since the day I met you in that field hospital in Da Nang, and every time you've proven that doubt wrong." What the world around Bill didn't understand was that his quiet presence had been shaping lives long before Morrison had even learned to drive. Every Tuesday evening, he volunteered at the local community center, teaching basic mechanical skills to unemployed veterans. Every Saturday morning, he could be found at the small airfield outside town, giving free flying lessons to kids whose parents couldn't afford summer camps. 3 weeks earlier, an anonymous donation of $50,000 had appeared in the account of Riverside High School's struggling STEM program, enough to build a complete aviation mechanics lab. The school principal had searched desperately for the donor, but the check came from an untraceable account, with only a note: "For the dreamers who think the sky is too far away." Back at Edwards, subtle changes were beginning to ripple through the daily routine. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who managed aircraft maintenance schedules, had been puzzling over some technical recommendations that had appeared on his desk. The suggestions were brilliant: small modifications that could improve fuel efficiency by 12% and reduce maintenance time by hours. The notes were handwritten, signed only with the initials WH. "Sir," Rodriguez approached Morrison after the morning briefing. "Do you know anyone with those initials who might have access to our maintenance protocols?" Morrison barely looked up from his phone. "Rodriguez, if some civilian wannabe is trying to tell us how to do our jobs, throw it in the trash where it belongs." But Rodriguez didn't throw it away. Something about the precision of those calculations, the deep understanding of aircraft systems, made him hold on to the papers. He'd been maintaining fighters for 15 years, and these weren't the suggestions of an amateur. Meanwhile, in the base's technical library, a young airman named Tyler Chen was struggling with a complex engineering problem for his promotion exam. The equations seemed impossible, the physics beyond his current understanding. Then, tucked between pages of an old flight manual, he found a handwritten explanation that broke down the problem into clear, understandable steps. The handwriting was the same as those maintenance notes. Chen looked around the empty library, wondering who had taken the time to help him. He'd seen an older man in civilian clothes studying in the corner earlier that week, but the man was always gone before Chen could approach him. Neither Rodriguez nor Chen knew they were experiencing the quiet influence of a man whose understanding of aviation went deeper than any textbook could teach. The emergency klaxon shattered the routine calm of Edwards Air Force Base at exactly 14:37 hours. Captain Morrison was in the middle of boasting about his latest simulator scores when the urgent announcement crackled through the hangar speakers. Code red emergency. F-16 Falcon experiencing complete avionics failure. Pilot unable to land safely. All qualified emergency personnel to runway 7 immediately. Morrison and his team sprinted toward the control tower, where chaos was unfolding. Through the tower windows, they could see an F-16 circling the base, trailing smoke from its electronics bay. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez was fighting for her life with an aircraft that had lost all its digital flight controls. "Tower, this is Falcon 7. Martinez's voice crackled through the radio, strain evident despite her training. "I've got no instruments, no GPS, no automated landing systems, flying blind on manual controls only." Colonel James Fletcher, the base commander, was pacing behind the controllers. "Options, people. What are our options?" "Sir," the chief controller replied grimly, "manual landing an F-16 without any electronic assistance. That's not something we've trained for in modern aviation. The pilots today rely too heavily on computer systems." Morrison stepped forward confidently. "Sir, I can talk her through it. I've got the most flight hours in the squadron." Fletcher nodded. "Do it, Morrison." For 20 agonizing minutes, Morrison tried to guide Martinez through the approach, but his instructions, based on computer-assisted flying, weren't translating to pure manual control. The F-16 wobbled dangerously on each approach, forcing Martinez to pull up at the last second to avoid crashing. "Tower," Martinez's voice was now tight with exhaustion and fear. "Fuel is at critical. Maybe 2 more approaches left." That's when Master Sergeant Rodriguez spoke up. "Sir, there's a civilian here who might be able to help." Everyone turned to see Bill Harrison standing quietly near the door, having heard the emergency from the parking lot. His weathered face was calm, but his eyes were focused intently on the aircraft circling above. Morrison scoffed. "Seriously? If we are going to trust some old mechanic to—" "Son," Bill's voice cut through the noise with quiet authority. "That pilot is flying a machine whose manual control systems I helped design 30 years ago. And unlike you, I learned to land fighters when computers weren't there to hold my hand." Fletcher studied the older man for a moment. Something in Bill's demeanor, the way he stood, the confidence in his voice, it spoke of real experience. "What's your background, sir?" 312 combat missions over Vietnam, 47 emergency landings, including 6 with no instruments in a burning F-4 Phantom. The tower fell silent, except for Martinez's increasingly desperate radio calls. Bill stepped to the radio. "Falcon 7, this is ground control. Switch to backup frequency 121.5. We're going to bring you home." "Who is this?" Martinez asked. "Someone who's been where you are, pilot. Now listen carefully. What happened next would be talked about at Edwards for decades." Bill's voice, steady and sure, guided Martinez through a landing approach that seemed impossible. He spoke her through reading wind patterns by watching dust on the runway, judging altitude by the size of ground vehicles, feeling the aircraft's weight distribution through the stick pressure. "Easy now, Falcon 7. Feel the ground effect starting to cushion you. That's it. Little more left rudder to compensate for that crosswind." The F-16 touched down perfectly, rolled to a stop without a single bounce. The tower erupted in cheers, but they died quickly when General Robert Hayes burst through the door. "What the hell is going on here?" Hayes demanded. Then he stopped dead when he saw Bill Harrison standing at the radio. "Well, I'll be damned," the general whispered. "Wild Bill Harrison." Morrison looked confused. "Sir, you know this maintenance guy?" General Hayes laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Maintenance guy? Son, you just insulted the most decorated fighter pilot of his generation, Colonel William Harrison, call sign Wild Bill, the man who saved more pilots in Vietnam than any other aviator in military history. If you want to see how respect is truly earned, make sure you subscribe to our channel, because this story isn't over yet." The revelation hit Morrison like a physical blow. This was the pilot whose legendary rescue missions were still taught at the Air Force Academy, the man whose innovative flying techniques had been incorporated into training manuals worldwide. Fletcher stepped forward. "Colonel Harrison, sir, I apologize for the way you were treated yesterday." Bill simply nodded. "No apology needed, Colonel, but perhaps it's time your pilots learned that wisdom doesn't always come with a fresh uniform." The silence in the control tower stretched like a held breath. Morrison's face had gone pale, the arrogance drained from his features as the weight of his actions settled in. Behind him, the other young pilots shifted uncomfortably, suddenly remembering every dismissive word, every mocking laugh from the day before. General Hayes continued, his voice carrying the gravity of military history. "Colonel Harrison here flew missions that would make your simulator training look like a video game. Operation Linebacker 2, the Christmas bombings. He was there. When Captain Rodriguez was shot down over Hanoi in '72, it was Wild Bill who flew solo into enemy territory to extract him." Bill raised a hand quietly. "General, that's enough. These young people don't need to hear war stories." "The hell they don't," Hayes replied firmly. "They need to understand who they insulted yesterday." He turned to address the group. This man didn't just serve his country. He revolutionized combat aviation. The Harrison maneuver, that evasive technique that saved Lieutenant Chen's life over Iraq in 2003, named after the man standing right here. Martinez had arrived from the flight line, still shaken from her emergency landing. When she learned who had guided her down, tears welled in her eyes. "Sir, you saved my life. I don't know how to thank you." Bill's response was characteristically modest. "You did the flying, Lieutenant. I just reminded you what you already knew." Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Colonel, we had no idea. The way we treated you yesterday was inexcusable," Fletcher interjected sharply. "Captain Morrison, you're confined to quarters pending review. The rest of you, consider this a lesson in humility that your careers desperately needed." But Bill stepped forward. "Colonel Fletcher, if I may, these pilots made a mistake, but they're not bad soldiers. They're young, confident, maybe too confident, but that's not always a weakness in aviation." He looked directly at Morrison. "Captain, you've got good instincts in the cockpit. I watched your flight patterns yesterday. You just need to remember that experience comes in many forms." Morrison's voice cracked slightly. "Sir, why would you defend us after what we did?" Bill smiled, and for the first time the young pilot saw the warmth that his students at the Foundation knew well. "Because 30 years ago, I was you, cocky, certain I knew everything, convinced that age meant irrelevance. It took a wise old instructor named Sergeant First Class Murphy to teach me that every person you meet knows something you don't." He paused, looking at each of the young pilots. "The question isn't whether you'll make mistakes. You will. The question is whether you'll learn from them." Rodriguez approached with the maintenance notes he'd been saving. "Colonel, were these yours?" Bill nodded. "Old habits. Saw some inefficiencies that reminded me of problems we solved decades ago." "Sir," Rodriguez said earnestly, "these modifications, they could save the military millions in maintenance costs." "Then use them," Bill replied simply. "That's what they're for." General Hayes stepped beside Bill, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Wild Bill, you've been retired too long? How would you feel about coming back as a consultant? These young hotshots could use some real training." The pilots around them, Morrison included, found themselves nodding eagerly, their earlier skepticism transformed into genuine respect and curiosity. Bill looked at Martha, who had arrived at the base after hearing about the emergency on the radio. She gave him the same encouraging smile she'd worn for 47 years. "Well," Bill said slowly, "I suppose the Foundation could use some new partnerships. And these pilots, they might benefit from learning how we used to fly when the only computer was up here." He tapped his temple. As the sun set over Edwards Air Force Base that evening, something fundamental had shifted. Morrison sat across from Bill in the base cafeteria, no longer the arrogant captain from the day before, but a young man genuinely eager to learn from someone who had walked paths he could barely imagine. "Colonel," Morrison asked quietly, "how do you do it? How do you stay humble when you've accomplished so much?" Bill stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "Son, the moment you think you've learned everything is the moment you stop growing. Every day I learn something new from the kids at my foundation. Yesterday, a 16-year-old girl from Detroit taught me a more efficient way to calculate fuel consumption ratios. Wisdom doesn't have an age limit. It flows in all directions." Around them, other pilots listened intently. These weren't the same men who had laughed and mocked 24 hours earlier. They were students now, hungry for knowledge from someone who had earned his authority through decades of service. "The hardest lesson I ever learned," Bill continued, "was that strength isn't about proving you're better than others. Real strength is lifting others up, especially when they can't lift themselves." He looked directly at Morrison. "You've got the skills to be an exceptional pilot, Captain, but skills without character are just tricks. Character is what turns a good pilot into a leader. Others will follow into hell." Martinez joined the conversation, her voice still carrying gratitude from the emergency landing. "Sir, what you did today, saving my life while we barely knew your name, that's the kind of person I want to become." Bill smiled. "Lieutenant, you already are that person. You trusted a stranger's voice in your darkest moment and executed a perfect landing under impossible conditions. That takes more than skill. That takes heart." As the evening progressed, Bill found himself surrounded by young aviators asking questions, sharing their own uncertainties, and listening to stories that bridged generations of military service. Morrison, who had started the day as Bill's chief antagonist, was now taking notes on a napkin, determined to learn everything he could from this living legend. "The truth is," Bill said as the group prepared to disperse, "every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. The janitor mopping this floor might be a former Navy SEAL. The quiet woman serving coffee might have 3 engineering degrees. The old man walking slowly through your base might have saved more lives than you'll ever know." He stood up, Martha appearing beside him as she always did. "Don't judge by appearances, don't assume you know someone's story, and never forget that respect is earned through character, not rank." As they walked toward the parking lot, Morrison called out, "Colonel Harrison, sir." Bill turned back. "Thank you for the lesson, for saving Lieutenant Martinez, and for forgiving us." "Nothing to forgive, son. Just remember what you learned here. If this story moved you, imagine carrying its lesson into tomorrow. How many times do we judge the book by its cover? How often do we dismiss someone because they don't fit our narrow definition of success or relevance?" Colonel Bill Harrison could have responded with anger, could have demanded apologies, could have used his rank and reputation to humiliate those young pilots. Instead, he chose grace. He chose teaching over punishment, understanding over revenge. The next time you encounter someone who seems ordinary, someone whose value isn't immediately obvious, remember Wild Bill. Remember that the person bagging your groceries might be a retired teacher who shaped hundreds of minds. The elderly man walking slowly ahead of you might be a veteran who once carried wounded soldiers to safety. True strength whispers, while weakness shouts. Real wisdom builds bridges, while ignorance builds walls. Ask yourself, what stories are walking around you that you've never bothered to hear? What lessons are waiting in the people you've overlooked? Don't let judgment blind you to the extraordinary hiding in plain sight. Subscribe to hear more stories that challenge how we see the world, and hit that notification bell, because respect and humility never go out of style. What's your story of misjudging someone? Share it in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.